Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Configuring and Using Veeam Monitor. In this lesson, we'll start off by connecting the monitor server that we just installed to our Virtual Center server so that it can start collecting statistics about performance. From there, I'll show you how to use performance charts, how to customize performance charts, how to configure alarms and use modeling, how to view events, generate reports, and then finally how to integrate Veeam Monitor with Business View. And with that, let's get started by moving over to our Veeam Monitor server. In this video, I don't have a lot of slides to show you. We'll be spending all of our time using and configuring Monitor. Here's the edition of Veeam Monitor that we installed in the previous lesson. The first thing that you need to do with any new edition of Veeam Monitor is to connect it to your virtual infrastructure. You can connect it either to an ESX server individually or to Virtual Center, which would give you visibility to all your ESX servers and virtual machines. So we're going to choose to use Virtual Center. I'll click right here, Add Virtual Center. I'll type in the host name for the server. I'll enter the username in domain/username format. As well as the password. Notice here that it says historical performance data import may take up to 30 minutes. During this time, real-time monitoring data will not be available. So keep that in mind. Don't expect the data and the charts and graphs to just immediately pop up. It's going to take a little bit of time to collect all this data from your Virtual Center server. I'll say OK here. We've added the new vCenter server. If I click on that, notice that it found the Virtual Center server over here. You see the build of the Virtual Center server, the number of events, but so far it hasn't found the data centers, clusters, hosts, virtual machines, and data stores. So what's going to happen is we need to give it a little bit of time. I'm going to pause the video recording. I'll come back in about 30 minutes, and we should have some data that Veeam Monitor has collected from our Virtual Center server. At this point, the Veeam Monitor server has completed collecting statistics from the vCenter server about the entire virtual infrastructure. As you can see over here on the left, we've got our vCenter server, but then we've got our data centers underneath that. And then in this data center, there's a lot of objects to look at. There's ESX host servers like ESX1 and ESX3. If we expand those out, there's resource pools as well as virtual machines. And then down here at the bottom, you see the data stores that are inside that data center. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, the very left-hand corner, you see Database Veeam Monitor, and it says it's connected. That's the database that Veeam Monitor is using, and it's a good thing that it's connected. That's important. The second thing here is in the middle at the bottom, it says Service, Veeam Monitor, and it's connected. So the Veeam Monitor service is running, and this Veeam Monitor application is connected to it. Over on the right-hand side here, you see Collector State, and it says Idle. So right now we're not collecting any data from the virtual infrastructure, but that collection will periodically run to pull down statistics about the virtual infrastructure from the vCenter server that we connected to. Now, most of what you use Veeam Monitor for, you'll do either over here on the left in the infrastructure tree to navigate between these different objects, or over here on the right-hand side with these tabs across the top to tab between the different types of reports and statistics that Veeam Monitor is going to give you. There's a couple more things you can do with Veeam Monitor. Up here on the top, you see the options. And underneath options, there's client settings and server settings. There's also a reporting button here to generate a report. And then there's modeling, which I'll show you how to use later. So that's really it. It's a real simple interface. You have the inventory tree, and then you have tabs across the top here with charts and graphs, as well as the three different buttons up here, options, report, and modeling. Now down here, notice the infrastructure view is what we're currently on, but there's also the business view, and here's where you would configure the business view server. I'll show you how to do that in just a little bit, but for now, let's talk about performance charts. I want to show you how to use performance charts inside Veeam Monitor. And the first thing I think that you should know is that the performance charts can wrap up in a hierarchical model here, with the highest point being the entire virtual infrastructure. So if you go to the highest point here, the entire virtual infrastructure, there are charts and statistics based on the entire virtual infrastructure. So here we have information about the top virtual machines, the top hosts in the infrastructure, hosts with the lowest load, alarms, and events for the entire infrastructure. Now, if you look at the top virtual machines here, for example, Now notice the highlighted links here. These highlighted links are like hyperlinks on a web page where you can click on these and drill down to these objects that are lower in this virtual infrastructure. For example, if I click on the vCenter server, it brings me down here to the vCenter virtual machine so that I can examine the performance of that individual virtual machine. Also notice up here on the left, it's just like a web page where you can click back and it takes you back to the object that you were on previously. And it works the same way with the top hosts here or any other object that you find in the virtual infrastructure. It even works on places like the Alarms tab here, where I can drill down to this alarm, or in the Events tab. Now if we scroll down a little bit lower, let's go down here to the vCenter level. The vCenter level is going to give you even more tabs. We have a summary about this virtual center server and the objects that are stored inside. There's an overall view, and notice how there's hyperlinks on this overall view. For example, CPU usage here. If I click on that CPU usage chart, it takes me to the CPU chart so that I can get a better view of the overall CPU usage for every object that's underneath this virtual center server. If we go back here to overall, something else I want to show you is the top line. Let's type in a top line right here of, let's just say 400 megahertz. Notice that line that appears across the top right here on the CPU usage chart. So this allows us to put in the top line, or what we think the maximum should be for whatever statistic we're looking at. So each one of these can have a top line. If you notice, every one of them has a top line that you can enter. For example, here we could type in 5, and notice the 5 gigabyte line now has a dotted line across it, and you're using that to indicate that that's the maximum that you want to see on that graph, perhaps, or maybe you just want a measure of the average. Anyway, it's a line that you can draw across that chart yourself to use as some sort of indicator. So that's what top line does. Also notice down here the chart options. If we click on chart options, we can customize this chart ourselves. So we can show performance data for the current object only, show performance data for these child objects, or show performance data for these individual virtual machines. So the child objects in this case are just specific data centers, but maybe we want to exclude a data center. You could do that by checking right there. You could also exclude virtual machines. Maybe there's a virtual machine in here that you want to exclude, like the Veeam monitor server. You want to exclude any resources that it might be consuming from appearing on the graph. I'll click cancel here, and that's just one way to customize a chart. Different charts have different chart options. So let's move across the performance charts here. Let's go into CPU. And one of the most useful things I see here is over on the right-hand side, you can select the time period for this chart. For example, right now it's on past week. I could select past hour, and there's a little CPU blip right there. I could also go to past day, month, year, or even select a custom time period. Maybe I want to select the last 2 hours or a particular date range. And that history is something that you're not going to get in the free product. I can also select counters here. For example, on the right-hand side here, I can select CPU used, CPU ready, CPU usage, and CPU usage megahertz. So notice that these come in different units. CPU used is milliseconds, whereas CPU ready is percent. I can also select the individual devices, just particular CPUs, over here on the left-hand side. If we go into chart options, it's the same chart options that we saw on the overall chart. And then here we can go into advanced. And this advanced option has to do with events. Notice here that we're checking to display known events. So what this is going to allow us to do is to correlate performance data that we see on a chart with some event that happened in the virtual infrastructure. So not only is Veeam Monitor pulling out performance statistics, but it's also pulling out events that happened in the virtual infrastructure. For example, live migration or vMotion, snapshot creation or snapshot removal, or even backups when backups occur with Veeam Backup. So obviously when a backup occurs, the load's going to increase, especially on the disk, but also on the other resources. So that's something that you want to have indicated and correlated with the performance data. So that's what a CPU chart looks like. And if we scroll across these other objects here, the chart options and counters and time frame are all going to be relatively the same. But notice if you change the time frame on one chart, it applies from here on out to every other chart that you select until you change that time frame again. Also notice that different types of performance objects are going to have different types of counters. Notice here in memory, we can show memory balloon, memory shared, memory overhead, memory active, or memory usage as a %. If we scroll on and look at the network here, we can see the counters for network. You might have individual NICs that you want to include or exclude, or maybe you want to graph based on packets versus bytes. Whatever you want to do, you can customize this chart. If we scroll on, there's disk information here, and notice down here on the bottom there's the performance chart legend, which is showing us the color for the different objects that would display on the chart, as well as the counter and the units for that object. If we scroll across here, there's also the latest, the minimum, the average, and the maximum. So at some point in the past, this maximum was hit. That might be of importance when it comes to solving some sort of performance issue. If we move on here to swap, of course you can chart swap information. If we move on to top virtual machines here, here's the last 5-minute stats for all the virtual machines in this virtual infrastructure underneath this virtual center server. There's top host information, lowest load. Perhaps if you have low load on an ESX host, you need to move some virtual machines over to that ESX host, right, to try to balance the load or take that load off of the ESX host with higher load. We can scroll on more to the right here and see alarms. Here are the events for the vCenter server, and then here is the Processes tab. Now, the first time you access this, you'll be asked to log in. You'll provide the Windows credentials for the vCenter server, and it works the same whether you're on the vCenter server or any of the other Windows or even Linux virtual machines that are being managed by Veeam Monitor. So what this does is it gives you a list of all the processes running on that virtual machine. You can see the processor utilization, the memory utilization. It's a lot like the Windows Performance Monitor. And then what you can do is you can choose to kill these processes or restart a service. You can also select the columns here that you want to view, and there's a lot of columns that you might want to check out to try to solve performance issues down at the virtual machine guest OS level. And again, this works in either Windows or Linux. So if we cancel that out, the last tab here on the vCenter server says VIC or VIC. If I click on this, it tells me that the VMware Infrastructure Client is not found on the local computer. What this is it accesses the VMware Virtual Infrastructure Client or the vSphere client if you're using vSphere. And it actually allows you to run the vSphere client inside Veeam Monitor. So there's a link here to download the VI client, but if you're running vSphere, I recommend you install the vSphere client. So with that, let me pause this video. I'm going to install the vSphere client. I'll be right back, and then you can see how this works. Okay, we're back. I installed the vSphere client, and then I restarted the Veeam Monitor client, went into the vCenter option underneath the infrastructure view, and then over here to the VIC tab, or the Virtual Infrastructure Client tab, which is now actually the vSphere client. And you can see we have a fully functional vSphere client here inside Veeam Monitor. So I can go through and configure and manage my vSphere virtual infrastructure without ever having to leave the Veeam Monitor client. It's a really cool feature, I believe, that adds a lot of additional value to the Veeam Monitor client. So with that, if we move on down from the vCenter view down into the Data Center view, there's very similar tabs across this view, but you get an overall picture of your entire data center. If we move to the ESX server view, again, very similar tabs here, but we have information about the ESX server host, the amount of RAM, the amount of memory usage, number of virtual machines, uptime, processor, and hardware information. We can also look here at the Hardware tab for this ESX host. We can see information about memory or any status alerts related to storage hardware, processors, power. We can see the fan speed and the temperature of the system board. There's also event information and then finally process information about the ESX server host. So to log into this, you'd have to provide the credentials for the service console on that ESX server host. And here you can see that I've sorted it by image name. If we scroll up to the top, there's information on all the Linux-based processes running on the ESX server host and important VMware processes like VPXA, and VMware host D. From here I can kill processes, or I can go up and I can add more columns to this view. If we move on down the infrastructure view here, there's resource pools, and I can see information here about CPU and memory shares. And then down to the virtual machine level, and here we have information about the virtual machine, like the number of virtual CPUs, the amount of RAM, information on the VMware tools, the state, and the uptime. If we move across the top here, there's the traditional tabs like the overall graph, CPU, memory, network disk swap, alarms, events, and what's unique here is the console. If you click on the console tab, this is the virtual machine console for this virtual machine. So just like over in the vSphere client, I can log in directly to the virtual machine and manage that virtual machine within the Veeam Monitor client. There's also process information about the virtual machine, just like we saw over on the Virtual Center virtual machine. So whether you're managing a Windows or a Linux virtual machine, you can access process information right here directly from the Veeam Monitor client. If we move on down the infrastructure view here, the next unique piece that we find is the data store view. There's information here about the 3 data stores in this virtual infrastructure. Here you can graph disk space over time. We can change this to the past week and see how our free disk space has changed over time. There's disk I/O charts, disk issues, and alarms that you can create related to your data stores. We can also go down to the iOmega SAN, which is the iSCSI storage area network, and here you can see the location of the VMFS files, number of virtual machines, number of hosts, total capacity, free space, and so on. So that's how you use performance charts inside Veeam Monitor, and I also showed you how to customize those performance charts by adding additional counters. So now let's talk about configuring alarms and using modeling. I showed you how each of the different objects in the infrastructure view here has an alarms tab. So if we go into the alarms tab, for example, on this data store, we can see that there is a default alarm already created. This is a default alarm to monitor storage. The frequency is every 10 minutes, and it's enabled by default. And that alarm was created up here at the data store view. And that's where you would go to modify that alarm. It works really just like the alarms do over in the vSphere Virtual Infrastructure client. So I can go here and I can edit the settings on this alarm. And again, it works very similar to the vSphere client. So here you have the alarm name, you have the rules, basically what is this alarm monitoring? What is this alarm looking for? And over what time period? Then you have reporting, which is where you configure the tolerance and frequency, and then the action is actually what will happen when this alarm is triggered. How will you be notified? And then finally there's suppression. For example, would you want this alarm suppressed when a backup is kicked in, or when a snapshot is being created, or during a certain time period? So that's the basics of alarms. Now let me show you how to create a new alarm. Let's go up to the virtual infrastructure level, the highest level where we could monitor multiple virtual center servers and multiple hosts and virtual machines. And if we go to the alarms tab here, you see all the default alarms that have been created. There's default alarms related to the ESX server host connection state, ESX host CPU usage, host memory usage, hardware problems, storage problems, virtual machine CPU ready, virtual machine CPU usage, and virtual machine memory usage. So by default, with Veeam Monitor, all these alarms are created. And for example, an alarm has gone off down here at some point in the past when ESX server number 1 hit a high host memory usage. Here we can click to either resolve or clear this list, or you can right click on it and we can go into the history here and see the history for this type of particular alarm. This way you know how many alarms have gone off related to host memory usage, and perhaps this is something that's just occurring all the time and the thresholds need to be set differently, or perhaps this is something that you need to be interested in and do something about. So if we close that out, what isn't configured by default is to alert you when something happens. So if we right click, let's say, on the ESX host memory usage, and I'll click Edit Settings, there's different types of alarms. There's ESX servers, virtual machines, selected nodes, and then data store alarms. If we go into rules here, you can see that this is a usage-based alarm, that it's monitoring the subsystem from memory, that the condition is above a warning number, which in this case is 75%, and the error is 90% utilization over a time period of 15 minutes. So this is where you would tweak those default alarms. And then what happens when that alarm is triggered? Well, if we go into reporting, right now there's no tolerance, but there is a frequency to not report a change if the alarm goes off within 10 minutes after it's gone off the first time. But what about actions? If we go to the Actions tab here, there are no actions. So it's going to show this alarm in the Alarm tab inside Veeam Monitor, but there's no actions to actually send you an email or an SNMP trap or anything like that. So to configure something like that, you click Add here. If we look at the type of actions that we can configure, again, very similar to the vSphere client, we can send a notification email, we can send a notification trap, or run a script. So let's say that we want to send an email. I'll enter my email address here. We can add that and say OK. But something else we need to configure to make that happen is up here in Options, we need to go into Client Settings, and then we need to go into Mail, and this is where we would go to configure our SMTP server. We would enter the host name of the SMTP server, and then maybe we would enter alarms at whatever our domain name is. So that's the from email address. We might need to enter authentication information here to send that email, and then you could perform a test here to make sure that it works. There's also more information about alarms over in the Alarms tab, and in fact this is where you would go to configure SNMP information if you wanted to send SNMP traps from Veeam Monitor. So here you would enter information like SNMP monitoring station dot my domain. You would enter the port number there and then the community string down here, such as public or whatever your community string is. You can also configure it here to send notification when alarm metrics are back to normal. So we could say cancel, since we don't want to save that. And then besides these default alarms, you can click here and you can create your own alarm related to either an ESX server, a virtual machine, or a data store. And the rules over here, if we click Add, the rules are going to change based on the type of alarm. So notice that data store alarms are coming up here. For example, you could create a rule to trigger an alarm when a data store is running out of free space, or if the I/O load is out of the allowed range, or if there's data store issues. But those rules are going to change based on the type of alarm that we created here. So if I change this to an ESX server alarm and go to Rules, then click on Add, notice that there's a different set of rules here related to alarms. So you can configure whatever alarms you want to at whatever level of the infrastructure that you want to create those alarms. And those alarms are going to be triggered if any object below that object, so these alarms apply to all the objects that are below them in the infrastructure view. And you're only limited to creating alarms based on the number of pre-configured rules that are allowed related to ESX server hosts, virtual machines, and data stores. So that's how you configure alarms, and the last thing related to alarms that I want to talk about is modeling. I'll cancel this out, and let's go up here to modeling. And I think this is a very nice feature of Veeam Monitor, because what modeling allows you to do is to search through the historical data and see if the alarms that you're about to configure would have been triggered and how often those alarms would have been triggered. So for example, we have these default rules, and if we use the data over the last week, that's the smallest amount of data we can search through, we can start modeling here. And based on the default alarms, these alarms would have been triggered. And if we look at the ESX host memory usage alarm, you can see here that that alarm would have been triggered 293 times at the warning level and 181 times at the error level. So this way we're going to know if the alarms that we're about to create or the default alarms that are created, how realistic those alarms are in our infrastructure and how many times they would have been triggered in the past. Because the last thing you want to do is to create a new alarm and then be getting an email every 5 minutes because the alarm values were really unrealistic for your infrastructure. So of course the more data that you have here, the better your modeling is going to be. So I suggest that you wait a week or maybe a month even and do some modeling and test out and see if your alarm values are realistic for your infrastructure, because every infrastructure is going to be different. So let's close out modeling here. And the next topic I want to talk about is events. I know I briefly touched on the Events tab that's present in almost every object in the infrastructure view. But if you go to the highest level here of virtual infrastructure, where we are now, and click on Events, you'll see a list of all the events that have occurred in the virtual infrastructure based on the time frame that's set over here. It could be just the past hour, could be the past day, or it could be a custom time period that you select. But you'll only see these events if you have this default checkmark checked down here that says Include Events from Child Objects. So at the highest level, you would see all the events across all the ESX servers, data stores, and virtual machines in the entire infrastructure, even if it's on a different virtual center server, if you're monitoring multiple virtual center servers with Veeam Monitor. So once you have this history of the events across the virtual infrastructure, then you can search or you can apply filters. For example, let's say I type in power on. There I get a list of all the power ons that have happened in the virtual infrastructure. And if I select one, you can see more information about it down here. So besides keeping a history of performance of the virtual infrastructure, Veeam Monitor also keeps a history of all the events in the virtual infrastructure, and then it can correlate the two and stick the two together so that you can see what events happened when and what impact that created on the performance of the virtual infrastructure. Alright, so that's events, and again, you can filter and search for events and do that on the Events tab across all the different objects in the virtual infrastructure. But if you go to the highest level and you have the checkmark checked down here, you can search for those events in one place. So now let's move on and let's talk about reporting. If we go to the Summary tab here, if I go up to Report, you can create HTML reports, trend reports, and you can even schedule reports inside Veeam Monitor. So let's start with HTML reports. Notice that the HTML report is grayed out here, and that's because there isn't an HTML report available for this type of object. But if we go, let's say, to an ESX server, and then let's click on the CPU graph, and we can change the time period, let's say, for the past hour, then go up to the Reports option. There's HTML report. We can click on that, and here we can create a nice HTML report. We'll give it a title, we'll give it an author name. We can do a report on all available data or just across a particular time period, the last year, month, week, day, or hour, or a custom time period with a particular date and time range. So we'll do all available data, we'll say next, and then here you can put in the type of performance counters you want to see on that graph. We can expand this out, and we can check whatever type of CPU, memory, network disk, or swap counters that we want to appear on the graph. I'll take the defaults and say next. Now we can say where we want the HTML report to be stored. If we just want to create a one-time report right now, we'll take the default option. But if you wanted to schedule reports and run this report, let's say every day or every week, you could do that right here. And then you could also email the report to one or more email destinations or save the report out on a file share. So let's go ahead and just create the report now. And it'll go into My Documents / My Veeam Reports. I'll say Next. We will opt to create that path. And there we go. It generated the report. We'll open the report by clicking Finish. And it brings it up in my web browser. So I can scroll down here and I can see information about the ESX server, as well as a CPU graph for all the data that we have contained in the Veeam monitoring database since we started running Veeam Monitor, which hasn't been very long, and that's why the report doesn't look very active. You can scroll on down and also see memory information here, network information, disk information, and swap. So we could take this report, and of course we could email it, we could print it, we could give it to our boss, or you could give it to your customer, let's say if you're a consultant. So it's a real pretty exportable report created by Veeam Monitor. The other type of report we could create is a trend report that outputs in Excel format. So let's click on that. Again, we'll take the defaults here, and we'll create this for ESX servers versus virtual machines. I'll say Next here. We'll use all available data and all the default performance counters. We'll opt to save the report and then open it up as soon as it's created. Okay, when we ran the report, you saw down there a little error popped up. Let's open up the Veeam Report Viewer. And you can see here it says that Microsoft Excel 2007 was not found. That's why the report wasn't opened up. So if you see that same type of error, you know how to figure out why. You just go down to your task tray and open up the Veeam report viewer so that you can figure out why the report didn't come up. But I really want to show you this report. So what I'm going to do is to pause the recording, I'm going to install Excel, and I'll be right back. With Excel installed, we can now take a look at this trend report from Veeam Monitor. What we're given here is a welcome screen on this tab with a nice table of contents for the different pieces that make up the report. There's CPU, memory, disk, network, and swap information. We can also use the tabs across the bottom to scroll through this information. We can look at CPU usage here, and you can see the CPU usage for the ESX server number 1. You can also scroll down and see more raw data that makes up that report. You can see memory utilization, memory activity. We can scroll through these reports here. Here's disk read speed, a lot more disk information, disk latency, network utilization, and swap utilization. So these are the Excel reports that were generated by Veeam Monitor. Just an example of the powerful trending reports that it offers. And I really like that they're exported automatically into Excel because you can do a lot of things once you have this data into Excel. Now, one last point about reports. If you go up here to Report and go down to Scheduled Reports, this will give you a list of the scheduled report tasks. Now, again, to create a scheduled report, you just go in and create a regular HTML or Excel trending report, but then at the end, you're given the option to schedule it. Now, optionally, you can go in here and add task and add an HTML or trend report directly from the Scheduled Reports window. And now let's talk about the last topic in this video, and that is integrating Veeam Monitor with Veeam Business View. Now, Veeam Business View is a free product from Veeam that allows you to view your VMware virtual infrastructure, how your business is organized. For example, you could view all the virtual machines that are related to human resources or marketing or to development, or all the ESX hosts that are related to one line of your business. And that's really important when you run performance and inventory reporting like you would in Veeam Monitor or in Veeam Reporter. So to connect Veeam Monitor to Veeam Business View, of course, first you have to have Veeam Business View installed, and then you go down here to the Business View tab, and that brings up the Options screen, and there's a tab in the Options screen related to Business View. So all you do is to type in your Business View server name here. In our case, that server is http://vmonitor:1340, with the login name being in domain/username format, vmonitor/administrator. I'll type in the password and click test here. So when I pressed enter there, the Veeam Monitor server connected to the Business View server and downloaded information about how our business is structured, things like business units, departments, and purposes, and how that matches up with our virtual infrastructure. These were, of course, pre-categorized over on the Business View server and pre-created. So if we look under Business Unit here, you can see that we have folders like Coffee Production and Coffee Sales. We can expand those out and see the virtual machines that make up those business units. Underneath Department, we have departments like Finance, Human Resources, and Marketing, and we can see the virtual machines that make up those departments. Down here under Purpose, we've got Development and Production and Uncategorized. So let's say that we wanted to pull up a performance chart on all the virtual machines that make up the Coffee Production business unit. I just click on that folder, and then over here on the right-hand side, I can see a summary that there's 7 virtual machines, and I can see performance data based on those virtual machines. I can see the CPU, memory, network, disk, and swap usage. I can go to the top virtual machines underneath that business unit. I can check out alarms or create alarms just for that business unit. And I can view events just related to virtual machines in that business unit. In fact, if we go up to Report and to HTML Report, we can run an HTML report just on the virtual machines contained in that business unit. And notice here the object that the report was run on is Coffee Production. So this report is based on the predefined categories, business units, departments, and purposes that I created over in Veeam Business View to view my virtual infrastructure, how my business is really run. So here's performance data based on the coffee production business unit at the Wirebrain Coffee Company. So that's how you connect Veeam Monitor to Veeam Business View to view your virtual infrastructure, how your business is designed. Again, Veeam Business View is a free product, and you saw how easy it was to connect to Veeam Monitor. And with that, let's go back to our slides. And that brings us to the end of this video covering configuring and using Veeam Monitor. In this video, you learned first how to connect Monitor to your virtual center server. That way, Monitor was able to pull down statistics and information about your virtual infrastructure. From there, I showed you how to use performance charts and how those performance charts are available at every level of the virtual infrastructure, and how those performance charts are really hierarchical in nature, so that if you go to the highest level, you'll see performance data for all the objects underneath, including ESX hosts and virtual machines. I showed you how to customize those performance charts by adding additional counters or correlating events that happen in the virtual infrastructure like snapshots or vMotions or Veeam backup events along with that performance data. Then I showed you how to configure alarms in the virtual infrastructure and how those alarms are also hierarchical in nature. You can use the default alarms, which work very similarly to vSphere virtual infrastructure alarms that you may already be familiar with. I showed you how the default alarms are already there, but you need to add some form of alerting so that you can get an email or an SNMP trigger. I also showed you how to use Veeam Monitor's modeling so that you can prevent creating alarms that will send off a lot of false triggers. Then we covered events, and I showed you how if you go to the highest level of Veeam Monitor, how you can search through events across the entire virtual infrastructure. You can also use that event history, and that event history is created over time, and you can view that event history based on various points in time. Then I showed you how to generate HTML and Excel trending reports, as well as how to schedule reports. And finally, I ended the video with showing you how to integrate Veeam Monitor with Veeam Business View to view performance information about your virtual infrastructure, how your business is defined. Thanks for watching this video covering configuring and using Veeam Monitor.